That means, firstly, a large part of the biblical stories about Christ and his statements definitely do not come from Christ himself. There are numerous accounts where Christ was alone. How could anyone know what he said in those moments? I mean, that's already a logical dilemma. So that means we find many contradictions in the New Testament, and then we even find statements that contradict the Old Testament, which is absolutely impossible in itself. And no, that does not happen with his physical body. And no, Jesus did not rise from the realm of the dead with his physical body like a zombie and shake hands with people. Unlike any church institution, we are not waiting for some external person to come to us and redeem or liberate us. True salvation, true liberation, can only happen within ourselves.
When you start looking into Gnosis, you find out that it's a suppressed teaching that many people don't even know about. So the first question would be, why was the original Gnostic teaching suppressed, and what did the church want to hide?
So first, it's important to understand, what is Gnosis, and how is all of this connected to Christianity and the church? The Gnostic teaching is one of the oldest currents of early Christianity, and the emerging church institution saw it as a threat because, in contrast to the church with its hierarchical structure, dogmatic beliefs, and interpretations, it spread a completely different doctrine, namely, the teaching of individual knowledge, that is, Gnosis, as the path to liberation. That means this fundamentally differs from the path of the Christian churches, the current churches, and to understand this, we need to take a closer look at history. Where do these currents come from, and what do they have to do with Christianity? First of all, the Gnostic teachings partly arose in parallel. There are similarities again, before Christ, and continued to develop during the time of Christ. There were well-known Gnostics who also played a role in the early church, among the early Christians, and who were later persecuted as heretics or removed from the historical accounts. Then, we have to fully understand that the current Christian church often refers to biblical scriptures that were actually created a very long time after the historical Jesus Christ. That means stories were passed down by word of mouth and, in many cases, even formulated in such a way as to support the doctrine or dogma of this structure. So, first of all, a large part of the biblical stories about Christ and his statements definitely do not come from Christ himself. First, there are numerous accounts where Christ was alone. How could anyone know what he said there? I mean, that's already a logical dilemma. And secondly, there are also things where maybe one person was present, and from that person there are no further records. And then, apparently, there are significant statements that took place in front of a very large crowd, like the famous Sermon on the Mount, and also important statements made before many of his devoted disciples. Interestingly, there is no other written testimony from the Romans or the like that could confirm all of this. That means you really need a lot of trust if you want to accept the statements of Christ, which are supposed to be mentioned in the New Testament from the very beginning, as 100% truth. And then there are a lot of contradictions, because there are also statements that contradict each other. And there are numerous statements that a master would never make in this way, if Christ was indeed a master. And the term Christ itself also indicates that he was considered a master. So, that means we find many contradictions in the New Testament. And then we even find statements that contradict the Old Testament, which in itself is absolutely impossible. Because Christ was a Jew, a righteous Jew who lived according to the law and affirmed every jot of the law. That means not abolishing the law, but fulfilling it. What does it mean, I have come to fulfill the law? That I have come to fulfill the law of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a collection of various books, not to abolish this law, but to fulfill it. But as some know, there are many movements within church institutions that do exactly the opposite of what is written in the Old Testament. Not to mention pushing aside the Sabbath and so on. That means the laws that are in the Old Testament were, if Christ was something like a Messiah, consumed afterwards. 100 years later, the first written records appeared, which are in the New Testament, but no other source has any written records. And that's very strange, because among the disciples and followers of Christ, there were many influential people from the Roman Empire, from the nobility and bureaucracy of the Roman Empire. They could write, they could pass on. And the fact that there were no records is a very strange thing. That means, just to say that Jesus said this and that is now the law is foolishness. Because there is no evidence that Christ said this. So that completely tore the ground out from under our feet. The whole chain of argument is gone. And why is Gnosis so dangerous? Yes, because they do exactly the opposite, toward inner knowledge, away from this dogma. And there are Gnostic movements that viewed Christ or this higher consciousness in a completely different way. They aimed for higher consciousness as the goal. They didn't see Christ as a single figure, as a godly being, but rather as a teacher who walked this path ahead of us, a path that anyone else can also surpass. And of course, that contradicts the dogmatic stance of the Church, which doesn't have any of these experiences, which doesn't pursue this inner knowledge, and which only deceives people into believing that something has been left behind in certain scriptures. Yes, but the scriptures are not proof, because there are also other writings. For example, maybe we'll get to that later. There have been plenty of excavations, other texts, Gnostic writings, that present a completely different picture of Jesus. But of course, these were persecuted by the Church back then and even today, burned, locked away in archives, so that other people wouldn't see what other traditions about Christ might exist, which are just as authentic, or inauthentic, as those in the New Testament. So that means, this argument, well, it's written in the New Testament, that's not an argument. Because the New Testament is not an argument. It's a work full of contradictions and also full of misinterpretations, because certain aspects were only interpreted into it afterwards, and in some cases even rewritten entirely. And yes, it's also remarkable that they are written in Greek, even though Jesus was a Jew, or actually, his teachings were passed on in Aramaic or in that old Hebrew, and even the Lord's Prayer is, word for word, a prayer made up of Jewish fragments, that is, from various Jewish prayers. That means there are Jewish roots there, and people wanted to separate themselves from that and present themselves as an autonomous church, as a religious movement, and distort all these things. That means the entire authority of the church would collapse like a house of cards if one were to deal with the facts objectively. And that's what the Gnostics do, namely by going back to the original, which is self-knowledge. All of this, or all of these teachings, some of which Jesus received from John, all of these teachings that he passed on as a teacher, had only one purpose: to awaken self-knowledge. And it is partly a metaphorical language and partly even a direct language. And if you were to cut out maybe 70% of the statements that are contradictory, then you can slowly reconstruct what the real teaching was that this person, this spiritual teacher, this master, wanted to pass on. And surprisingly, there are also Gnostic movements from that time that trace back to John the Baptist and, for example, consider Christ and the Church as heretics in this sense. That is, as those who have completely distorted the teaching, or rather, what people have made out of Jesus, because it was not the teaching that John the Baptist left behind, nor the rites that John the Baptist established with baptism and so on, with this process of purification, the initiation of baptism, and the ordination of priests. That means this is a danger for the Church, because it loses its authority. Because it is based on appearance and not on being, on what is hidden in the background. And for Gnostics, there is only one thing: direct self-knowledge. Without self-knowledge, the path is worthless. Without self-knowledge, the Christian path is worthless. If we do not pursue this self-knowledge, then we are not Christians either. That is, not awakened to Christ. And anyone who reports something on the outer level, just from hearsay, is irrelevant. That's because the true miracles, the real acts of wonder, have only ever been performed by Gnostics. And so we also see, yes, they are a concentrated force and a real threat to these institutional church paths, because at the core they show why this pseudo-Christianity is simply a totally distorted religious path.
The kingdom of God that comes up often when you read the New Testament, and one statement is precisely that the kingdom of God is within us. And so the question is the kingdom of God really within us, or has this message been distorted?
In the Gnostic texts, especially in the Gospel of Thomas, there are also statements attributed to Jesus, where it is reported that the kingdom is not here or there, but within us. So that means this is a stage of the kingdom. But that also means, as within, so without. If there is something within us, then there must also be something outside of us, as within, so without. But this also means that the divine reality is not somewhere far off in the future, and that this promise of salvation and waiting for some new Messiah, nor anything awaiting us after death in that sense, but rather it is an inner experience. Anyone who does not have this inner experience, and this is the same as with the stages we see in the New Testament, the birth, life, and death of Christ, meaning birth, Christmas. Anyone who does not experience the birth of Christ within themselves will not enter the kingdom. That means the higher consciousness, Christ is a symbol of higher consciousness, must awaken within us, must be born within us. If it is not born within us, then we are simply on the wrong path, then we are worshippers of the devil. Why? For example, there is this famous number 666, the number of the beast, of man. And yes, that is also the number of the sun. The number of the tempter, in another sense. Because the temptation lies elsewhere. So, not the act of tempting temptation itself. Because when we look at our celestial body, that is, the sun, the central star of our solar system, we can see a ball of fire there, and it is actually the giver of life. And all these processes that take place on Earth happen because of the sun. And now, we could worship this external symbol of the sun. And that's exactly the beast, that's exactly it, that's what's twisted, that's this perversion, that's this materialism, that's this false worship of a personality cult. Or we can view the consciousness of the sun as the higher consciousness. That is, this fiery star as a body, and behind it lies a consciousness. And this consciousness is the higher consciousness, the highest consciousness in this cosmos, that is, in this solar system. And that is the sun consciousness. And it's the same with Christ. We can worship him as a person, which is what the church does. And that's exactly this distorted faith, this inverted pentagram, this false materialism, and this waiting for the Savior, or the consciousness of man that lies within us. This higher consciousness that we share. Christ does not have a different consciousness, he simply has access to, let's call it by the term, sun consciousness. That's why there are so many sun symbols in the New Testament. And that's also the same consciousness that is in us and around us, which we can also experience. And that's not the highest consciousness we can experience. And to think, now we're a good Christian and start following these commandments, which we misinterpret anyway, and then we think we'll enter the kingdom of heaven. That's a mistake. That way, we're guaranteed to end up in purgatory. Everyone ends up there. It's simply a process of purification. There's nothing we need to run away from. It's a purification process to dissolve the lower aspects of our being and take the next step. So that means the first step to enter the kingdom of heaven happens within ourselves. And of course, on the level of evolution, there is also something like the kingdom of heaven. Because when it is said that Christ has ascended, meaning an ascended master, then the next world awakes. That's a symbol of this kingdom of heaven, the next world. We are here in the material world, and the next world, that is evolution. That means we have to go through the stages of this material world so that we are ready for the next higher one. That is not the very last world. It is one of several worlds to enter into the next world. And we can't do that without certain changes, both internal and external. We need to have a vehicle, that is, to create a body that is capable of existing in this next world. And no, that doesn't happen with your physical body. And no, Jesus did not rise from the realm of the dead with his physical body like a zombie and shake hands with people. Quite the opposite. He created a vehicle, which is also called Merkaba. That's this chariot here. Those who are interested can further engage with the Kabbalistic mythology. Merkaba is the work of the chariot. That's what Merkaba is. And this vehicle is necessary so that we can experience the ascent to the next higher level. Why? Vehicle. Yes, we have vehicles here, and we don't just have one vehicle. We have a physical body. We have a vehicle of the intellect, through which we can express ourselves, through which I can, for example, speak now with an audience. And we have emotions, through which we can process experiences and experience things more intensely. Then we have soul levels. These are all vehicles as well, and yes, in order for us to reach a higher level, to experience evolution, which is really the master achievement, the ascension, we need a vehicle, and that's the next vehicle, and it's called the Merkaba. That's this vehicle. Please don't confuse this with any strange ISO Merkaba trends. It all has this geometric signature. That has nothing to do with the Merkaba. Merkaba is an esoteric teaching from the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, where certain vessels are created along the path of initiation that enable higher consciousness and evolution. This isn't some kind of toy at esoteric seminars. These are real stages of initiation, real evolution. And that's an esoteric teaching, and we need preparation for it. It goes far beyond ordinary enlightenment. It's about creating a vehicle to make the transition from one world to the next. And for that, it takes enormous preparation, purification, transformation. And that's what's being talked about when, during the Ascension, Christ's ascension, is described. That's the crossing over. And Christ was not the first one mentioned in the biblical scriptures. Elijah, too, ascended to heaven. You can simply look it up in the relevant passage in the Bible. Elijah ascended to heaven. He wasn't the only one either, and there are plenty of other examples. That means this is an old symbolism that explains how a person experiences this evolution, and these symbols are used to describe ascending to the next world. And it's just like when we're in school now, let's say elementary school, and then we move on to the next level of school. Is that something extraordinary? No, if we complete tasks here, next tasks simply follow. Is it something we have utmost, highest respect for, we fall to our knees because person achieved it? No, simply what awaits people. That's evolution. Just like a stone doesn't fall to its knees when it sees a human and says, wow, has reached a high level of evolution. Yes, we are at a higher stage of evolution than a stone, plant, or animal. But that's different, and it's the same with humans. And that's where this term comes in, although it's not well chosen, that a superhuman, because it's historically loaded, but rather, it's about transcending the ordinary human. And this transcending to the next stage of evolution, that's what is meant by the kingdom of heaven. But on the first level, it is about recognizing the kingdom of God within oneself. Then we are able to recognize the kingdom of God on the outside. And then to recognize the stages and the heavenly realms, and then to gradually accomplish the ascent step by step.
What does it mean to be a divine spark, and how can one remember their true nature?
Yes, in Gnostic teachings, humans are described as bearers of a divine spark. This is the indestructible part of the highest light, the part that has fallen into the material world. And, yes, most people cannot remember this truth. And yet, it is omnipresent. The divine spark also has a name in Greek, in ancient Greek, pneuma. This is the pure, immortal essence of the human being. It sounds very, very abstract, but if we really feel into these words, this divine spark is what makes a human truly human. It's not the body, not the thought, not the mind, but this divine spark. And we notice, this really has to do with fire and with the highest aspects of creation. And that's how evolution can take place. And that's how evolution happens. That's how creation can occur. And there are also many intersections with Kabbalah regarding the divine spark, this correction, and the liberation from these shells. And the divine spark comes from the highest divine level and enters the material world, where it is, so to speak, just to picture it, trapped in shells. And these are the shells of illusion. That's why we perceive the world as so separate. To experience a you, to experience an I and I want, to experience a big ego, and I want this and I want that. That has to do with this spark, and to cause this damage all around. But that's also absolutely necessary so that we can establish a diverse world of great diversity on the very first level. Otherwise, diversity wouldn't be possible. Otherwise, on the subconscious level, we would only experience unity and therefore no differences. That means all colors would just be white light. And this way, we now have the opportunity to experience a palette of colors, shapes, and possibilities, even though in reality it's all light. Vibration, a light, the boundless light, without differentiation. But because of this, we can experience it, this masterstroke of creation, to put something into creation and, to make it something we can experience. And this material world, that is, our cosmos, in a way, is not the true home of humanity, but as most people recognize, perceive, and feel it, it's almost like a prison. We are imprisoned. And in Gnostic terminology, the term demiurge is used for this. In some Gnostic paths, it's like a selfish creator god. So, this selfish creator god, just so you can picture it clearly. And so there are also some Gnostic currents that say, yes, the God of the Old Testament and the jealous God, that's the demiurge, that's this evil creator God who sent us here and imprisoned us. Yes, from a limited perspective that's also true, but from a much, broader perspective we can then recognize that this is a phase of creation that is necessary, and this evil creator God doesn't actually exist. And there is also no punishing God, and there is no rewarding God either, rather, it is a path of evolution, of liberation. And as already mentioned earlier in the retreat, we don't need an external punisher. We punish ourselves. We are the perpetrator, the judge, the executor, all in one. Life couldn't be more just. When we experience hatred, envy, discord within ourselves, we punish ourselves. We don't need anyone else for that. That is the greatest punishment we can experience. We suffer through it, we live through it. And that is a painful life. And at the same time, we are punished by ourselves. So, does it require an external demiurge? No, it does not. An external demiurge, well, you can use it as a symbol, but there is no such thing as an external demiurge. Having an external demiurge would be the same as saying there's a personified devil out there somewhere, and there isn't. It's just a distorted view of reality. In Gnostic teaching, there are several aspects. There is pneuma, which is spirit, psyche, which is the soul. Then there is sarx, which is flesh. This is the threefold nature of man. Then there is, a kind of informational synosis, the light from Sophia. Sophia is the wisdom that has fallen into the world and is hidden from humanity. And the Gnostic insight is that humans are not of this world. That means they are not this matter, and they are independent of this matter. He can have this experience through this matter. It is a gift of this creation to be able to experience diversity and unity. But he is not of this world and he is not dependent on this world. And any teaching, whether scientific or not, that brings us into this, into a false duality and claims that we are dependent on all these things. No, we are not. Because at the last breath of God, when everything is taken back in as breath, we will still exist. At that point, this material creation no longer exists, but we will still be, and that is what is so special about this creation. But not as the separate being we think we are now, or this ego, or this, I am experiencing this, but rather, as consciousness. And this divine spark is surrounded by a dense shell of ignorance. That is agnosia. And that's interesting, because some politicians describe themselves as agnostic. I mean, that's the same as if someone were to say they're stupid. So they use this term like that, they go out there and say, well, it's not me, I don't really believe, I'm agnostic. But in reality, it means I'm stupid, because ignorance is exactly that, stupidity. So how someone can label themselves like that? Okay, but that's a prime example. Okay, if a president in a country says, I'm an agnostic, people would say, for God's sake, we have an extremely ignorant and stupid politician. That means the goal of a human being is to be a Gnostic, that is, to gather knowledge and to live by that knowledge. And the material world is designed in such a way that it keeps people distracted, entangled, and forgetful. That means he believes these distractions are the world, these entanglements are necessary, and he constantly falls into forgetfulness, into self-forgetfulness. And some of you may have experienced this. You have an insight, a flash, a brief dawning of reality, and after a few weeks you can barely remember it. That means it hasn't become solid yet. That is part of this necessary play of entanglements, distractions, and forgetfulness. And this forgetfulness is, in principle, also necessary in Gnosis, necessary in order to be overcome. And in the cosmology of the old Gnostic teachings, there is this demiurge. We can interpret him however we want. That's a vengeful god or something like that, because we can't understand it any better. He is a symbol, and he has something like archons. These archons have created structures. That's what we live in now. Societies, dogmas, religions, fears that keep people trapped in illusions. So, if someone is looking for someone to blame, okay, in Gnosis there is a name for that. Those are the archons. And the path of Gnosis is to free oneself from that, from this ignorance. And we also realize that the Gnostic teaching isn't really just about Christianity. There are tendencies from Greek teachings, from Egyptian teachings. There are wisdom traditions that arose around Alexandria and were passed on. They all come together like rivers in a Gnostic teaching. That means that's also why it differs from small church perspectives through this holistic view. And there are many well-known Gnostics who have left behind writings. For example, in the excavations of the last Gnostic texts, some Gospels can be read by anyone. We also have some of them in the library at Hermetic International. There, anyone can read the old Gnostic texts in translation. In the original, they're in ancient Greek, but yes, we have them available in German and English. And Gnosis, that is, this knowledge, is the key to this divine origin and that leads to the liberation of the human being. That is the path to liberation. That means, unlike some church institution, we are not waiting for some external person to come to us and redeem or liberate us. True redemption, liberation, can only happen within ourselves. No one can heal us from the outside. We can only heal from within. Anyone who deals with the topic of healing will come to this realization sooner or later. Healing, no matter how much we try to force it from the outside, the final step of healing can only happen within ourselves. If we do not heal from within, healing will not take place. And so there is also a term for true remembrance, and it does not come through intellectual knowledge, reading, books, information, or even my words, but through inner experience. Similarly, we can read about riding a bike, watch a YouTube video about cycling, learn all the physical laws of how cycling works, and read about what happens biologically in our bodies. But that still doesn't mean we can actually ride a bike. And anyone who learned to ride a bike as a child knows, okay, you fall down a few times, and sometimes it really hurts, but eventually you manage to keep your balance and ride a bike. But that's the doing, that's the experience. And it's the same with Gnosis. It's not about reading about it, it's not about debating it, dissecting some strange laws, arguing back and forth, doubting, or weighing pros and cons. It's the inner experience. If someone can ride a bike, there's no need to argue with them about cycling or what laws apply there. They can ride a bike. Period. It's the same with the church, for example, or with institutions. The church can't ride a bike, but someone who can ride a bike, the church can't explain to them, this is how cycling works. They just think, what's wrong with you guys? Why are you explaining cycling to me? I ride a bike. So, first get to the level where cycling actually exists. That's the experience. Then we can keep talking about it. As long as you're just telling some weird stories, always going back and forth, debating, and persecuting everyone else. That's not the experience yet. And of course, there are several ways. There are rituals, there is meditation, contemplation, the path of silence, of perception, yes, different ways we can take on the journey of or towards self-realization. Namely, to awaken from the illusion in order to experience this divine spark and to bring this divine spark back to life. That is also the return to Sophia, to knowledge, when one is on the way home to the light. In some spiritual traditions, this is also called inner silence. In the East, perhaps, it is self-realization and detachment from the world of illusion. In Gnosticism, perhaps, it is the return to the origin, to the primordial light. So, to sum it up in one sentence, the divine spark is the true essence of the human being, and the material world keeps this essence in forgetfulness. That is this vibration. But it can be corrected and elevated. That means, it's not, something that is set in stone and can only be that way. That means it can be changed, it can be transformed, transmuted, corrected. That means the task of the human being is not just, oh, I really free this spark, no, but rather he can correct it. He can even lead matter and all of that along with himself into redemption, into liberation. So, in the higher stages of self-knowledge,
Why does Gnosis talk about an illusory world, and how can one escape from it?
so the world is often referred to as Kenoma, which means the void. Right, so Kenoma is Greek, it's an illusion that keeps people trapped in ignorance. The world itself is not an illusion. It's the interpretation of the world that is the illusion. That means, that's a pitfall on the spiritual path. Yes, everything is an illusion. No, the world is not an illusion. The interpretation of this world is illusory. That is the deception. That's why we need higher senses. That's why we have to train certain tools within ourselves better, so that we can interpret this world better, interpret it more correctly, and see through this appearance to reality. The world as we perceive it is not, well, not perceive, but the world that most people interpret as what they perceive and take for reality, is not the true reality or actuality, but rather a distorted, incomplete creation. That means, a patchwork. That's what most people interpret and see. They don't see the connections, they don't see the link to themselves. They think the world is separate and that things just happen out there by chance, without involving them. So, there's the world, and then there's me, and somewhere out there are drivers, and there's a tree. They can't recognize this connection between inside and outside, cause and effect, above and below. That's patchwork, that's the illusion. And everything in this material world appears transient. It has to be that way, because that's the illusion. Limited and imperfect. But everything in reality, that is, what lies behind the appearance, is imperishable, unlimited, and perfect. It's exactly the opposite. Everything we perceive through our misinterpretation is not lasting, it appears, painful, full of suffering, and sometimes especially bizarre. That means forms that don't fit together at all, situations that aren't coherent. Something that seems like coincidence, those are unknown laws. And what is behind that, behind the appearance, is reality. Beyond all of that, that is the true world. So once again, Kenoma, this Greek term, is the doctrine of the imperfect world that hides the true reality. Pleroma, the true divine world, is beyond this material misinterpretation. And then there is the veil of deception, and that is why consciousness remains trapped for so long, because it considers this material world to be absolute and insurmountable. That is, as the basis and foundation of life, and here we already see the paradox in all scientific movements. How do we search for life? Yes, do these material prerequisites exist? That is not even the question, whether we even. But first we have to recognize, what is matter? And what are our misinterpretations? Then we can take the next step and find life. Life exists in abundance in this cosmos. Most people are still not able to recognize life as life. And finally, the world, as most people experience it, is an illusion in the sense of a deception caused by their sensory experience. Not because it is an illusion. And reality, let's just call it that, what truly is, lies behind, beyond, or within it, our true creation. It is unlimited, it is perfect, always right, always connected, always one. And the misinterpretation tricks us into seeing an evil world. Evil, arbitrary forces that are ill-disposed toward us. And that's why there are such symbols in Gnosis that describe this. The true world is neither good nor evil. It is an interaction of forces that serve evolution. And to most people, the world appears like a test, difficult, an illusion, but still not entirely meaningless. And believe it or not, even the most evil person can gain insights. Even the most immature person can gain insights. Maybe not right now in the area where he was evil. Maybe this is just a side example. Maybe there is a bank robber who violently robs banks, takes people's money, injures and kills people in the process, and maybe he's a good father. It's simply a different area of life. Maybe he's good in that area, but in the other, he's deeply evil. That means even the most wayward person can have insights in one area of life. This is a principle that is deeply rooted in Gnosis. That means there is a tendency that pulls us upward toward insights. Even if it doesn't become immediately visible in all areas of life, it can show up in a tiny little area. Or maybe someone has a pet that they love especially much and build a special relationship with, no matter how violent the person might be otherwise. And then, in Gnosis, it's all about one thing: awakening through experience. It's not just about a lightning bolt effect, but about experience, interaction with life, so that the world reveals itself to us as what it truly is. That is reality. That's what Gnosis is about, and that's a path that isn't much different from many other spiritual paths. That means it would really be, wrong to claim Christianity is a unique religion. Yes, the interpretation of Christianity as done by the churches, yes, that's unique, it came about in a strange way. But the foundation, the teachings of Christ, they're not different from many other, esoteric traditions. Rather, the core essences are identical.